Hi, how are you? I'm Lile. Let's start with a line. After the fire is extinguished, even the ashes are cold. Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre-Dame starts with this line. Today, we're going to talk about this book, which is written by the French author Victor Hugo. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, like Jane Eyre, 100 Years of Solitude, The Red and the Black, and other world classics, carries significant fame. Even if you haven't read it, you've probably heard of it, and many people, even if they haven't been to Paris, know about Notre-Dame Cathedral. In the bell tower of Notre-Dame lives a grotesquely deformed but kind-hearted bell ringer named Quasimodo. Paris's Notre-Dame Cathedral is Quasimodo's home. What does the real Notre-Dame Cathedral look like? It was constructed from 1163 to 1345, taking the people of Paris a prolonged 182 years, to build such a cathedral entirely out of stone. Because of this, Hugo in his novel describes Notre Dame as a symphony of stone. It's a Gothic cathedral, and the hallmark of Gothic architecture, as you might guess, is its height, straight lines, and pointed arches. The spire is particularly sharp, seemingly reaching upward through the clouds towards heaven. Another distinctive feature is its stained glass windows, where sunlight streaming through creates a dazzling, dreamlike display that's perhaps what people imagine heaven to look like. In April 2019, a piece of news shocked the world. Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire, causing the collapse of its spire and significant damage inside. Fortunately, Quasimodo's bell tower survived. French President Macron vowed on that day to rebuild the cathedral together. As of now, France is still in the process of repairing Notre Dame, with plans to reopen it by the end of 2024. We eagerly anticipate the moment when Notre Dame will reopen. Adding a bit of background here, what does Dame mean? The Dame in Notre Dame refers to mother. On the facade of Notre Dame, you can see two figures, the Virgin Mary and Saint Anne. The Virgin Mary holds a child, that's Jesus Christ. Mary is Jesus's mother, and Saint Anne is Mary's mother, making her Jesus's grandmother. Being over 850 years old, Notre Dame Cathedral has witnessed numerous significant historical events, such as Napoleon's coronation and many shining moments in human history. In 1996, Disney adapted The Hunchback of Notre-Dame into a family-friendly animated film, featuring stunning visuals. The animation was adorable, faithfully depicting everything from the panoramic view of Notre Dame to the intricate details of its statues. I watched it with my daughter and highly recommend it to everyone. On top of Notre Dame Cathedral, there are some small monsters, each with grotesque faces and eerie expressions. My daughter asked if they were similar to the Palace Museum's giant monsters. These monsters have silently overlooked the perplexed city of Paris for over 800 years. In the animated film, these various monsters even chat with each other. What are these monsters on the outer walls of the cathedral used for? Actually, they serve a practical function as drainage outlets. Some say that Notre Dame Cathedral will be immortal in Hugo's writing. Indeed, while buildings may deteriorate, the power of literature transcends time and remains ever fresh. Hugo wrote this work in just 6 months, and the work was hailed as one of the greatest novels of the 19th century and a representative work of romantic literature today. Despite being separated by over 600 years, you'll be amazed to find that the characters and events in the book, including human emotions and complexities, are still readily comprehensible today. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame revolves around 4 characters. First, there's Esmeralda, the beautiful and kind-hearted gypsy girl. Second, there's Claude, the seemingly dignified but inwardly evil archdeacon. Third, there's Captain Phoebus, handsome but morally dubious leader of the archers. And fourth, the one we're very familiar with, Quasimodo, the deformed and kind-hearted bell ringer of the cathedral, also Claude's adopted son. Here's a brief overview of the story. In the 15th century, Claude Frollo, the archdeacon of Notre Dame Cathedral, lived a life of celibacy for over 30 years. However, one day he tragically, and yet fortunately, falls in love with the gypsy girl, Esmeralda. This love brings him immense torment. On one hand, his sinful desires make him feel he's betraying his religious vows, and on the other, Esmeralda doesn't love this old and ugly priest at all. The beautiful girl has her heart set on someone else, the young and handsome military officer, Phoebus. So, Frollo devises a scheme. He frames Esmeralda for attempted murder on Phoebus and falsely accuses her of witchcraft, intending to use his authority to force her into submission and to beg for mercy. Unexpectedly, Frollo's own adopted son, Quasimodo, comes to Esmeralda's rescue, taking her to sanctuary within the cathedral when she's in peril. Enraged, Frollo orders her arrest by the court. Desperate, Esmeralda escapes sanctuary and miraculously reunites with her long-lost mother. However, in a desperate attempt to attract Phoebus's attention, she inadvertently kills her own mother and is ultimately condemned to the gallows. After these dramatic events, Quasimodo sees through the archdeacon's true nature of cruelty and betrayal. In despair and rage, the bell ringer tragically pushes his foster father off the tower of Notre-Dame, then embraces Esmeralda's lifeless body, choosing to perish alongside her. This roller coaster of a story reveals deep emotional highs and lows. Let's delve deeper into the details. Let's start with the bell tower freak. Quasimodo's debut was dramatic and memorable. It was in Paris in 1482, and it was tradition to choose that year's King of Fools. The rules were as follows. Everyone present took turns to stick their heads out of a carved window hole and act out a funny laugh, and whoever laughed the grottiest was elected King of Fools. This was a popular entertainment event for everyone involved. But obviously, who could outdo Quasimodo in terms of ugliness? Although Notre Dame Cathedral has been adapted into many films and TV series, the character of Quasimodo has always left a lasting impression. However, visual adaptations cannot quite capture the same level of imagination and unconstraint as the written word. In the original work, Quasimodo's appearance is described in a way that no real actor could fully embody. About that quadrangular nose, that horseshoe-shaped mouth, that bushy red eyebrows beneath which his little left eye was almost hidden, his right eye being entirely covered by a huge wart. About those uneven teeth that stuck out like the battlements of a fortress. About that rough mouth with an incisor projecting like the teeth of an elephant. About that forked chin, and about the whole mask of him, in short, which looked at once so grotesque and so terrible. These descriptions only depict a part of the surface of Quasimodo's appearance, leaving much to the imagination. When Quasimodo is led out from behind the carved window of the chapel during the Feast of Fools, people finally see his whole body. His entire body is a spectacle of oddity, with a large head covered in red hair, and a hunched back rising between his shoulders. His deformity is evident from every angle as he moves. He was extremely awkward in both limbs and legs, almost as if only his two knees could come together. From the front, they looked like two sickles joined at their handles. How can a person resemble sickles? Hugo's imagination is truly remarkable. He also had oversized feet and terrifying hands. Hugo concluded, he was like a giant statue that had been shattered but not properly glued back together. It is really not known from what observations Hugo created such an image, but it is certain that Quasimodo must have been a synthesis of countless images. How did such a man born so eccentric survive? This brings us to Quasimodo's adoptive father. That would be Father Claude. Claude came from a noble family, albeit a small one, and was considered a middle-class family of the time. Under the strict discipline and arrangement of his parents, he was destined from an early age to devote himself to the priesthood in this life. With talent and diligence, this diligence reached obsessive levels. From a young age, Claude mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, excelling in multiple disciplines. He was a true academic prodigy. Using Hugo's words, he experienced every stage from becoming a bachelor to a teacher and various academic masters. However, a plague took the lives of tens of thousands, including his parents, leaving only his infant brother, named John. This event, was a turning point in Claude's life. As an orphan, eldest son, and a 19-year-old head of the household, he was suddenly called back from the dreams and passions of school into the cold reality. Thus, he began to focus on raising his brother John. Through this background introduction, we discover that Claude was someone who had never loved anyone except the books. Yet now, he found himself experiencing a strange yet sweet sensation. He was about to begin raising a tiny infant. This parentless little brother, this child who suddenly dropped into his arms from the heavens, transformed Claude into a new person. It made him realize that beyond the theories of theology and the epics of Homer, there were other things in the world. What did this signify? Claude understood that humans need emotions. He knew that without warmth and love, life is like a dry wheel, squeaking and clattering as it turns. What a fitting metaphor. Although Hugo lived in the early 19th century, and this story occurred in the distant 15th century, it still resonates today, reminding everyone that life remains meaningful with the presence of love. Claude experienced this feeling firsthand. He treated his little brother John with infinite tenderness, feeling the weight of a significant responsibility that made life more serious. Thus, he became even more dedicated to his religious duties. By the age of 20, he obtained special permission from the Roman Curia and became a priest at the Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. One Easter Sunday, as Claude passed by the cathedral, he discovered an abandoned infant on a carved wooden pallet, wrapped in a sack, only revealing a hideous head with a tuft of red hair. The child had only one eye, and his teeth looked terrifying. Who was this? We all know this poor little fellow was Quasimodo, rejected from birth by his parents and left there. When Claude saw the unfortunate little thing, that miserable condition, that deformity, and the abandonment on the cold ground, he thought at once that if he himself had perished in the plague, the same sad fate would have befallen his brother, little John, left on such a wooden couch, with no one to care for him. Therefore, Claude suddenly felt a deep compassion. You see, emotions unfold in such ways. He took Quasimodo away with him, and thus Quasimodo became Claude's adopted son. By the way, Claude gave this adopted son the name, Quasimodo. What does it mean? The meaning is the first Sunday after Easter. Yes, this is a completely factual statement. Quasimodo grew up by his adoptive father's side, within the Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, and eventually became the bell ringer of this church. Hugo writes in his book, "As time went by, a certain intimacy linked the bell ringer to the church. Origin unknown and hideous in appearance, these twin disasters had long isolated Quasimodo from the world. Since childhood, he had been imprisoned within unbreakable dual bonds. This unfortunate man, sheltered by his religious bulwarks, had grown accustomed to seeing nothing outside. As he matured and grew, Notre-Dame was his shell, his nest, his home, his homeland, and his universe. Between this being and this building, there surely existed some mysterious, superhuman harmony. From a young age, he hunched his back and stretched his neck in the dark corners of those arches, crawling about without anyone knowing what he was thinking. With his human face and bestial limbs, he seemed to have grown up as a reptile in those dark, damp places. Later, when he mechanically grabbed the ropes on the bell tower for the first time and swung the bell to ring to his adoptive father, Claude, it seemed like a child speaking aloud for the first time. And so, Quasimodo found his place and sense of existence within the church. He hardly ever stepped outside the cathedral. He wasn't just a resident here, he was an inseparable part of the church. He explored and climbed every corner of Notre-Dame, familiarizing himself with every protrusion of the building. People often saw him climbing outside the two bell towers, much like a gecko on a steep wall. Of course, Quasimodo's deep attachment to Notre-Dame Cathedral stemmed largely from his extremely strange appearance. This caused him to endure disdain, mockery, aversion, and unwarranted curses from people. Consequently, he preferred the company of the cathedral's statues and spoke to them instead of people. Additionally, as a form of self-protection, he became quite ferocious, displaying a gentler side only when faced with the bells. He gave names to each of the 15 bells in Notre-Dame, such as Marie, Jacqueline, and others, gently caressing them and speaking to them. Quasimodo's greatest joy was the moment he rang these bells. Hugo vividly describes it. The grand concert began, and the entire bell tower trembled. Woodshelf, lead plates, and stones all roared simultaneously. Quasimodo, joyful, frothed at the mouth as he paced back and forth, shaking from head to toe like the bell tower itself. The great bell opened up, crazily swung its enormous bronze throat left and right across the tower, unleashing a tempestuous peal. As the bell swung back and forth, Quasimodo crouched and stood before its gaping throat. Suddenly, the frenzy of the bell infected him. His gaze became bizarre, like a spider awaiting prey. As the bell swung back, he swiftly climbed and hung on it, suspended high in the air, swinging with the bell as it desperately rocked to and fro. The bell tower shook. Quasimodo shouted and ground his teeth, with hair standing on end, his chest resonating like a bellows, and eyes flashing. That strange great bell, panting beneath him, emitted a hoarse roar. Thus, it was no longer the bell of Notre-Dame or Quasimodo, but a dream, a whirlwind, a storm, a faint above the clamor. This passage from the novel exemplifies the characteristic language of the period, dense and sprawling like the magnificent walls of Notre-Dame Cathedral, showcasing Hugo's exceptional talent. Now that we've met the priest and the bell ringer, let's turn to another key character, Esmeralda. She is a beauty, and in the novel, she makes her entrance at the Place de Grève. Let's view Esmeralda through the eyes of the down-and-out poet, Gringoire. She wasn't tall, but her graceful figure made her seem taller than she was. Her hair, slightly brown, must have glistened beautifully, like that of Roman and Andalusian women in the sunlight. She danced and twirled on an old Persian carpet casually laid out at her feet. Every time she spun around, every time her radiant figure passed by, her dark eyes would flash towards you. She would raise a small Basque drum high above her petite head with her strong, rounded arms. To the beat of the drum, she danced, slender and lively like a wasp. She had a melodious name, Esmeralda. She also had a white goat named Jolly with golden horns and hooves. This little goat could perform tricks and mimic the comical gestures of aristocrats. Esmeralda and her goat arrived in Paris with a band of wanderers. She danced, sang, and directed her goat to perform tricks in the square to earn a living, bringing endless joy to the people of Paris in exchange for the copper and silver coins they threw to her. Thus, the priest, the bell ringer, the down-and-out poet, and the wandering bohemian girl Esmeralda, seemingly unrelated individuals, became intertwined in a legendary tale due to a dramatic encounter. How did this fateful meeting come about? Let's return to January 6, 1482 to find out. What day was it? Since ancient times, it had been a day to celebrate Epiphany and the Feast of Fools. In the Palace of Justice in Paris, a mystery play was being performed, written by our down-and-out poet, Pierre Gringoire. Unfortunately, no one paid much attention to his work. This unlucky poet, unable to earn his fee, had no money for food or lodging and wandered the streets. On that day, as he wandered into the Place de Grève, like everyone else, he was instantly captivated by Esmeralda dancing at the center of the crowd. Among the spectators was another notable figure, the Archdeacon of Notre-Dame, Father Claude. Esmeralda's impact on the priest was profound, almost philosophical. He stared at her intently, his eyes filled with a magical light. Then, the procession of the King of Fools arrived at the square, including ragged vagabonds, thieves, and disabled people, along with acrobats. The newly elected King of Fools was none other than Quasimodo. He held a scepter, wore a robe, and had a crown on his head, proudly seated at the center of the procession. It was his first time feeling a sense of self-respect and joy. He was completely immersed in happiness, dominated by pride, and his melancholic, unfortunate face glowed with radiant light. However, just as Quasimodo was reveling in his bliss, his adoptive father, Father Claude, stormed in and stopped the procession, angrily snatching the gilded scepter that symbolized the King of Fools. There was a gasp of horror as people saw the fearsome Quasimodo leap from his seat. The original text says, "Women turned away, not wanting to see him tear the archdeacon to pieces." But instead of this scene, Quasimodo knelt down to the archdeacon and allowed him to pull off his crown, break his scepter, and tear that glittering priest frock. Yes, there were only two things that the ferocious Quasimodo revered greatly. First, Notre-Dame, and second, his adopted father. Due to his deafness, Quasimodo could only communicate with Claude through gestures. They used a secret sign language that no one else understood. After some gesturing, the two of them walked away into a narrow alley, and the crowd dispersed. At this point, Esmeralda had finished her performance and was heading back to her residence. Our down-and-out poet, under some strange spell, was inexplicably compelled to follow this beautiful girl. He trailed her through a maze of alleys, past the market and the gallows. Just as the girl turned a corner, the poet heard a sharp cry. He saw her being seized by two men, struggling in their arms. He didn't know who they were, but they were trying to silence her, preventing her from screaming. Her poor little goat was also terrified, bleeding with its head down. "Help! Night watch!" It was a cry for help from the down-and-out poet. He cried out as he bravely went forward to try to save the maiden. At this time, one of the two men who had seized the maiden turned his head, and the poet recognized at once that it was Quasimodo with that terrible face. Quasimodo came toward him, backhanding the poet, sending him sprawling onto the stone road several feet away. Then Quasimodo quickly turned back into the darkness, lifting the girl as if she were a silk scarf draped over his arm. The poet watched helplessly as Quasimodo and his accomplice abducted Esmeralda. Can you guess who Quasimodo's accomplice was? Yes, none other than Archdeacon Claude. Quasimodo would only obey his adoptive father. This time, he had come to abduct the girl under his father's orders. However, the plan didn't succeed because the poet's cry for help was heard by Captain Phoebus, the captain of the archers of the king's Praetorian Guard. He arrived just in time to save Esmeralda and capture Quasimodo. Claude, amidst the chaos and darkness, quietly slipped away. The story doesn't end here. Our unfortunate poet woke up from unconsciousness to find everyone gone. He continued walking and was soon beset by three beggars. Confused and disoriented, he stumbled into the sanctuary area. What kind of place was this? Extremely dangerous. Let's see how the novel describes it. The sanctuary area was the thieves' domain, a hideous tumor on Paris's face. It was a gutter where the waters ran every morning, sending back the vagrants, beggars, and malodorous wanderers who roamed the capital streets by night. It was a vast hive of villainy, where the drones brought their plunder every day. Like a deceitful infirmary, it harbored all sorts of corruption and filth. Here, bohemians, defrocked monks, disillusioned scholars, people of different nationalities and religions mingled together, their bodies covered in painted sores. Beggars by day and thieves by night. This was a grand dressing room where all the robberies, prostitution, and assassinations of the streets of Paris were orchestrated and executed. Our unfortunate poet found himself surrounded by these denizens of the dark, who then dragged him to their leader. This leader, the same man who had been at the head of the procession of thieves during the Fool's Day parade, intended to have the poet hanged. The poet, naturally unwilling to accept such a fate, entered into negotiations, and only one chance for survival remained. According to Bohemian law, if a woman stood up and declared her willingness to marry a condemned man, he would be spared. So the poet looked around desperately. 3 women stepped forward from the crowd, including beggars and ugly old hags, but after a few questions, they all rejected him. Just as the poet was about to despair, a young girl stepped forward and boldly declared, "I want him." This girl was none other than Esmeralda. This beautiful rose had spoken the words, "I want him." The leader of the sanctuary area brought forth a jug and instructed the poet to smash it on the ground. The jug shattered into 4 pieces. The leader placed his hands on the foreheads of the poet and Esmeralda and declared, "Brother, she is now your wife. Sister, he is now your husband. For 4 years, go now." The poet's life was spared, but was Esmeralda truly willing to marry this down-and-out poet? No, she had no desire to marry this unfortunate man. She only did so to repay him for his cry for help, which she perceived as a small act of saving her. Although the poet's call for help had been of little practical assistance, Esmeralda still felt indebted to him. So she stood up and declared her willingness to marry him, thereby repaying the debt. This marriage was, of course, in name only, but it revealed Esmeralda's character. She was compassionate and loyal, with a clear sense of gratitude and justice. Now let's turn back to Quasimodo. After being captured for kidnapping Esmeralda, he was taken to the scaffold at the Place de Grève to be flogged. What was the scene of the punishment like? The rotating wheels suddenly brought Quasimodo's towering hunchback in front of the executioner, who then raised his arm, swinging the finely crafted whip in the air, producing a hissing sound like a water snake. The sound of the whip cutting through the air indicated its immense force. One lash after another, the whip landed ferociously on the poor man's shoulders, with the lashes falling on his body like rain. Soon he was bleeding from the blows, and spectators saw thousands of streams of blood running down his dark shoulders. As the whip swung through the air, some blood droplets splashed onto the onlookers. The spectators, who were disgusted by Quasimodo, showed no sympathy. They kept mocking, cursing, and throwing stones at him. Quasimodo struggled in his chains, glaring fiercely at the crowd in an attempt to intimidate them. But the prolonged whipping and torture made him extremely thirsty, and he shouted hoarsely and angrily, "Water!" Here Hugo provides a thought-provoking description. This pitiable cry did not elicit any sympathy. Instead, it made the crowd laugh even harder. This is the coldness of the spectators. Everyone thought Quasimodo's current appearance was not pitiful, but rather made him appear more grotesque and unapproachable. They were happy to see someone like Quasimodo suffer, enjoying watching his purple-red face drenched in sweat, eyes wild, mouth foaming with rage and pain. It was like watching a trapped beast. They did not see him as a fellow human being, a concrete person. Quasimodo was so thirsty that half of his tongue stuck out of his mouth. At this moment, not a single kind-hearted man or woman from the crowd dared to offer the suffering man a cup of water. The loathsome steps of the scaffold were considered shameful and repulsive, and good people were unwilling to step on them. It's not hard to see Hugo's satire in this passage. He criticizes how difficult it is for people to empathize with others and understand their suffering. Kindness at times can be so hard to manifest. Chinese readers are familiar with such scenes from Lu Xun's works, whose novels contain deeply resonant descriptions of similar human indifference. When Quasimodo shouted desperately for water a second and third time, a dramatic scene unfolded. The crowd suddenly parted to make way for a strangely dressed girl. She was very beautiful, accompanied by a snow-white goat with golden horns and holding a small drum. Who was this? Esmeralda. Quasimodo's single eye flashed as he recognized her as the girl he had tried to abduct the previous night. He vaguely realized that it was because of this incident that he was now chained here and being flogged. Therefore, Quasimodo believed that this girl had come to take revenge on him, just like everyone else, and would start beating him. But the girl silently approached Quasimodo, who twisted his body to avoid her. Instead of hitting him, she took out a gourd from her chest and gently brought it to the poor man's cracked lips. What was she doing? She was giving Quasimodo water. At this moment, people saw a large tear rolling out of the always dry, burning single eye of the monster, and slowly flowing down his long, wrinkled, ugly cheek. This was the first tear Quasimodo had ever shed in his tragic life. He felt the power of kindness and love. The story, as it progresses to this point, shows these important characters being called together by fate, entangling them further and leading step by step towards the climax. What happens next? When we naturally focus on the two main characters, the pitiful Quasimodo and the kind-hearted Esmeralda, we might overlook another crucial character in the novel, which is the Archdeacon Claude Frollo. In the year the story takes place, Claude Frollo is around 36 years old, already a middle-aged man. Hugo describes him as follows. Claude Frollo was no longer the simple student of the Torchy Theological Seminary, no longer the gentle protector of a child, nor the dreamy young man who was familiar with some things and unfamiliar with others. He had become a severe and brooding priest, a soul keeper, and a grim and terrifying figure. When he crossed his arms and lowered his head to his chest, people could only see his bald forehead. As he solemnly and thoughtfully walked slowly under the high arch of the choir, everyone trembled in his presence. Yes, he was very stern and seemed not easy to deal with. In the bell tower of Notre-Dame de Paris, Claude Frollo had set up a secret little room for himself, dedicated to studying alchemy. Let's take a look at a medieval alchemist's workshop, which is quite unique and seldom found in other novels. It was a gloomy room with a comfortable chair and a large table, several compasses and distillers, animal bones hung from the ceiling, and a globe rolled on the floor. There were glass bottles filled with various colored potions, some with golden leaves trembling inside. Several skulls lay on parchments covered with strange writings and portraits. A pile of manuscripts with dog-eared corners spread out on the table, along with some obscure maxims written in Latin or Greek. Claude was obsessed with the study of alchemy then. Once King Louis XV came to visit Claude in disguise, led by his royal physician, to ask questions about alchemy. As Claude was explaining to the king the mysterious symbols hidden in many church buildings, he suddenly sighed and pointed with one hand to the open book on the table and with the other to Notre-Dame, saying that this one was going to destroy that one. His implication is that the invention of the printing press would ultimately replace the art of architecture. We can reasonably assume that this is Hugo's genuine sentiment, as he expresses a profound sorrow over the decline of medieval architectural art. Hugo writes, "The thoughts of each generation are no longer written in the same way or with the same materials. Even the solid and enduring works written in stone will give way to those created with paper and printing, which are even more solid and enduring. One art is destined to overthrow another." We can see that Hugo is writing about the transformations of his time, with technological advancements bringing about significant changes. He metaphorically compares Notre-Dame de Paris to a book, starting from the earliest monuments to the grand cathedrals. He devotes extensive passages to describe the entire history of Parisian architectural art. Thus, the novel Notre-Dame de Paris, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, holds research value and cultural significance beyond its literary merits. In the preface, Hugo tirelessly calls for the preservation of ancient monumental buildings and declares that this is one of the primary goals of his novel and one of his lifelong pursuits. It shows that Hugo had a grand vision. Returning to the novel, since the first time Claude Frollo laid eyes on Esmeralda, he fell uncontrollably in love with her. This caused Frollo immense anguish, leading him to instruct Quasimodo to kidnap the girl. He then begged the archbishop to issue a decree to expel her and even meticulously researched ancient witchcraft cases, seeking justifications to prove she should be burned at the stake. Ultimately, all his efforts were in vain, as Esmeralda continued to dance in the Place de Grève every day, Claude found himself unable to rid his mind and heart of this beautiful girl. His misfortune was intensified when he discovered that Esmeralda had fallen in love with another man, Captain Phoebus, the officer who saved her that night. Since Phoebus displayed his heroic spirit, Esmeralda became irretrievably enamored with this handsome officer. At just 16 years old, she was incredibly naive. Through the voice of the down-and-out poet, Hugo described her. Esmeralda was an innocent and charming girl. She was passionately naive, understanding nothing, and yet eager about everything. She couldn't even tell the difference between men and women, not even in her dreams. She was the kind who loved dancing and revelry, who thrived on fresh air like a queen bee with invisible wings, living in perpetual whirls. As this perpetually vibrant girl wholeheartedly loved the handsome officer Phoebus, she had no idea that this was the beginning of a tragic fate. This man is a complete playboy. He has been engaged to a noble lady, but he still goes around looking for women. Seeing that this beauty was in love with him, how could he let go of the duck that flew into the pot? So he decided to date this girl and possess her. Claude found out about this, so he followed Phoebus all the way to their date at the inn. Just when Esmeralda was about to surrender herself entirely, to dedicate herself to love, that furious Claude could no longer contain himself. He rushed out and, with a pre-prepared dagger, stabbed Phoebus. Poor Esmeralda was so frightened by this scene that she fainted. Claude took this opportunity to flee. When people arrived at the scene, they believed Esmeralda had killed Phoebus, and she was arrested. During her trial, she endured a ridiculous spectacle, a vivid reflection of the dark judicial system of the Bourbon dynasty in which Hugo lived. Let's examine one of the absurd and ludicrous scenes. Esmeralda was brought in for questioning alongside her innocent little goat. The prosecutor of the Royal Religious Court picked up the girl's hand drum from the table, lifted it up in a particular manner in front of the goat, and asked, "What time is it now?" The goat, with its clever eyes, looked at her, lifted its golden hooves, and tapped 7 times. It was exactly 7 o'clock at that moment. Then the onlookers generally showed expressions of fear. How could a goat be so clever? It must be a demon. And worse yet, when the prosecutor shook the movable letters inside a small pouch on the table, people saw the goat use its hoof to arrange the letters into a name, Phoebus. Everyone was shocked again. Does the goat have wisdom? Of course not. It was just Esmeralda's way of expressing her admiration for her beloved. But now, in the eyes of bystanders, it was clear evidence of sorcery. So Esmeralda was sentenced to death by hanging. On the day before she was to be hanged, Claude went to her cell and confessed everything to Esmeralda. He told her how he had fallen madly in love with her, how he had killed Phoebus, and said that as long as she was willing to be with him, he could help her escape, and they could run away together, far and free, sparing her from the gallows. Claude even crawled to Esmeralda's feet, begging without any dignity, saying, "If you have any compassion, I beg you not to reject me. Show some mercy. If you came from hell, then I will go back with you. Everything I have done is for this. Your gaze is more lovely than God's." As soon as she heard these cheesy words from the priest, it was clear how mad he had become. However, what did Esmeralda think? This was a madman who had killed her lover, so besides fear and extreme hatred, she couldn't possibly feel anything else. So Esmeralda rejected the priest, insulting and cursing him. Claude was completely despairing. He decided, if I can't have her, then no one else will either. Let her die. According to the law, Esmeralda had to go before the priest for her final confession before being executed by hanging. The priest who was to hear her confession was none other than Claude. So, in the square in front of the church, Claude stood there sanctimoniously, seizing the opportunity to approach Esmeralda once more, begging her to flee with him. "If you don't leave, you're doomed." But he was rejected once again. Thus, Claude loudly pronounced Esmeralda's fate, ordering the executioner to take her away to be hanged. After making this decision, Claude was also in despair. He couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen, so he fled alone. Claude alternated between agony and jealousy, imagining a life together with Esmeralda, imagining tender intoxication. Then he would think of the noose tightening around her fair neck, strangling her, and this would cause him to break down in pain. So Claude ran uncontrollably until dusk. He wanted to escape nature, life, himself, humanity, even God. It was a process of collapse. Here, Hugo's depiction of despair is deeply penetrating. Love is merely a common spark, whereas despair, for whatever reason, carries philosophical significance. However, psychologically and philosophically speaking, escape is futile. Whether facing immense pain, despair, or joy, the only way forward is to confront it directly. So what happened to Esmeralda in the end? Just as soldiers were preparing to put Esmeralda back into the prisoner's cart and send her to the gallows, this woman actually saw, standing on the corner balcony of the square, a person. Who was it? It was Phoebus. Yes, Phoebus was actually alive. Esmeralda's heart filled with excitement and joy at seeing the young officer she loved was still alive. But unfortunately, although her lover hadn't died, Phoebus didn't step forward to clear Esmeralda's name. At this moment, the terrifying gallows still awaited Esmeralda. It was clear that this officer didn't truly care about Esmeralda at all. At that moment, Quasimodo appeared. As the executioner prepared to carry out the order, the peculiar Quasimodo suddenly leapt over the railing in front of the building, using his hands, feet, and knees to grasp the rope. People then saw him descend like water, dripping down glass, sliding along the wall in front, as though leaping from a rooftop like a cat. He swiftly ran towards the two assistants, knocking them down with his enormous fists, and lifted the gypsy girl as one would a doll, then swiftly disappeared into the church. The bell ringer raised the girl high above his head, shouting in a terrifying voice, "God! God!" And the people echoed, shouting the same, clapping their hands joyously. Quasimodo's single eye gleamed proudly in that moment. What had happened? At that time, there was a law stating that even criminals condemned to death were protected once inside a church, deemed inviolable under divine sanctuary. Without a doubt, Quasimodo had acted heroically, rescuing his beloved and defying the grip of justice. He felt immensely proud. Thus, with the power of God, Quasimodo shattered the authority of those officers, judges, executioners, and the king himself. And so, Quasimodo took Esmeralda away, settling her in a small room beside the tower, providing her with clothes, food, and bedding. Esmeralda lived in the church, deeply moved yet still wary of Quasimodo. When she slept, Quasimodo watched over her secretly, guarding her door. When she woke, he silently withdrew to remain unseen, humble in his devotion to the woman he loved. Esmeralda couldn't help but feel moved by his actions. She pulled Quasimodo close to her, looking upon him with sympathy for his many flaws. Poor Quasimodo said, "I have never understood my ugliness as clearly as I do now. When I compare myself to you, I pity myself greatly, for I am a pitiful, unfortunate monster. And you are sunlight, a dewdrop, a bird's song. And I am a terrible creature, neither man nor beast, something more rough, ugly, and misshapen than the stones beneath my feet." And he laughed, the saddest laughter in the world. One day, Esmeralda saw Phoebus on the square from the rooftop. Overjoyed yet pained, she reached out to the square, tears streaming down, calling out Phoebus's name. Though deaf, Quasimodo understood everything and suffered deeply, knowing her heart belonged elsewhere. From that day on, he never appeared before Esmeralda again. So everyone wonders, if Phoebus hadn't died, wouldn't Esmeralda's murder charge have collapsed on its own? Why couldn't she regain her freedom? Yes, because Phoebus did nothing to help Esmeralda clear her name. Moreover, when Esmeralda saw Phoebus, she also saw a noblewoman leaning against him that day. But Esmeralda kept lying to herself, insisting that the handsome officer still loved her. You see, love can plunge people into such humble circumstances. Let's talk about Archdeacon Claude now. Esmeralda was abducted by Quasimodo, and Phoebus didn't die. Claude's heart was filled once more with pain and jealousy, his madness escalating. So one day, he sneaked into Esmeralda's room with ill intentions. Fortunately, Quasimodo arrived in time, once again saving Esmeralda. This incident also exposed Claude's ugliness to Quasimodo. As the archdeacon, Claude also knew something else. The sanctuary area, regardless of the church's sanctuary tradition, issued an order to drag Esmeralda out of Notre-Dame and hang her. So, Claude found the destitute poet Gringoire, and together they plotted to abduct Esmeralda. Gringoire willingly undertook the task, believing Claude acted out of kindness and justice. He actively persuaded the beggars and thieves to attack Notre-Dame on the eve of the execution, rescuing Esmeralda, and perhaps more importantly, using the opportunity to loot the church. During the reign of Louis XV, law and order were chaotic, with rampant banditry. The police were unreliable, considering themselves lucky if they didn't rob the people, while the royal palace guards almost always had their own defense forces. Churches, uniquely, often relied solely on their sanctity for protection without defensive measures. So that night, the army of beggars began their assault. However, they encountered a major problem. Quasimodo was inside Notre-Dame. This poor deaf man couldn't hear their shouts, unaware that these people were Esmeralda's friends and family coming to rescue her. He thought they were coming to take Esmeralda away to the gallows. Therefore, Quasimodo did everything in his power to protect his beloved girl. He engaged in fierce combat against hundreds of men. The beggars used hoes and shovels to break down the church doors, while Quasimodo hurled a massive beam down, crushing 12 people. The mob used this beam as a battering ram against the doors, so Quasimodo pushed down large stones prepared in advance, smashing them on their heads. Then the wandering army didn't give up. They took turns attacking, and it seemed like the doors were about to give way. In his desperation, Quasimodo had a brilliant idea. He lit bundles of lead sheets in 2 stone troughs directly above the main doors, letting the molten lead flow down like lava onto the heads of the beggars pounding the doors. The scorching liquid burned them horrifically. The people screamed in agony, finally realizing who was resisting them in the firelight. They said it was the bell ringer Quasimodo, but many insisted it was some ghost of a nobleman, not just Quasimodo. The flowing lead didn't cease, preventing them from getting closer to the doors. Just as the besieging army seemed helpless, clever John, remember him, Claude's own brother, arrived with a ladder. Leading the charge, he rushed up the wall. As John reached the corridor at the top of the wall, he looked up and witnessed a terrifying sight: Quasimodo standing before him. What followed was a horrifying scene witnessed by everyone below. Quasimodo seized John's arms with his left hand and slowly disarmed him with his right, stripping him of all his weapons, sword, dagger, helmet, and armor, as if he were peeling a walnut as a monkey. Quasimodo stood upright on the balcony railing, holding John's legs upside down, swinging him like a slingshot in the air. Then, a sound like a coconut shell smashing against a wall echoed. Something fell and landed a third of the way down the building, coming to rest at a corner. It was a corpse. John lay crumpled, his back broken, his head shattered, lifeless. This sight shocked the crowd, and then unleashed a frenzy of bloodlust in human nature. They angrily shouted and brought ladders from all directions, assaulting Notre-Dame. Even with Quasimodo's extraordinary strength, he couldn't hold this place any longer. Just as he neared despair, the king's army arrived and routed the ragtag army of beggars. Exhausted but overjoyed, Quasimodo hurried back to Esmeralda's room, intending to kneel before her and assure her that everything was fine. But the room was empty. Esmeralda was gone. Who had taken her away? This, it turns out, is the scheme of the poet Gringoire, taking advantage of the fact that the beggars are attacking from the front with great fanfare to draw away Quasimodo. The poet and Claude then quietly slipped into the church through a small side door and took Esmeralda away. Esmeralda recognized Gringoire and thought she was safe now, believing they had come to rescue her. She followed the two men and crossed the Seine in a small boat. However, unbeknownst to her, our destitute poet, under Claude's threat, abandoned Esmeralda. So Esmeralda was abducted by Claude, who took her to the center of Place de Grève and revealed his identity by lifting his hat. Esmeralda was horrified to find out he was the archdeacon. What was Claude planning to do? He was truly insane. He pointed at the gallows and said, "Now, between the gallows and me, you can choose one." How could she choose? Ultimately, Esmeralda still chose the gallows. Yes, she would rather die than compromise with him. So Claude summoned the king's soldiers and ordered the execution. He personally led the girl to the gallows, then returned to Notre-Dame, watching it all from the balcony of the bell tower. The sun had just risen, illuminating everything. Quasimodo finally saw from afar at Place de Grève a person holding Esmeralda in white clothes, her neck looped in the noose. It was a scene of despair. Even though Quasimodo would have given his life to save her, the Seine River separated them, leaving him helpless, only able to watch. Suddenly, the man kicked away the ladder, and Esmeralda hung there struggling. For a moment, breathless Quasimodo saw the unfortunate girl, Esmeralda, swinging at the end of the rope. The man then placed his feet on her shoulders, and the rope turned a few times. Quasimodo saw the gypsy girl convulse horribly, and then die. This was the most tragic moment, with a devilish smile, a smile no longer human, bursting from the archdeacon's grim face. Quasimodo couldn't hear the laughter, but he clearly saw that smile, recognizing the face of the devil. The hunchback retreated a few steps from behind Claude. What was he going to do? Suddenly, he angrily pounced on the bishop, on his foster father, and on the man he had lived with for decades. With both hands, he pushed Claude in the back. The priest cried out, "Damn it!" and fell down. Thus the priest and Esmeralda died at the same moment. And poor Quasimodo? He stood there like a man struck by lightning, unmoving and silent. A long string of tears quietly streamed down from his single eye that had only shed one drop of tear before. His beloved girl was dead, and his foster father was dead. He lifted his eyes to gaze at Esmeralda from afar, then lowered his head to see the fallen Archdeacon Claude, whose appearance was now a mess. From the depths of his heart, he let out a sob. They were all people I loved. And so everything ended. At the conclusion of the entire novel, also marking the final fate of our protagonist Quasimodo, equally imbued with a tragic and heroic significance. In the charnel house under Montfaucon, people found two bodies among the frightening bones, one embracing the other tightly. One set of bones belonged to a woman, still with remnants of what must have been a white cloth. Who could this be? Of course it was Esmeralda. The other set of bones tightly hugged her. He was a man, and people saw that his spine was bent, his skull nestled between his shoulder blades. One leg bone was shorter than the other, and there was no injury on his shin bone, so it was clear he wasn't hanged. This man must have gone to that cemetery by himself and died there, dead beside this girl, still tightly embraced her when he died. People wanted to separate him from the corpse he was embracing, but he fell down and turned into dust. That was the end. Quasimodo and his beloved girl turned into skeletons, turned into dust, but love did not disappear. A few years ago, when Notre Dame in Paris caught fire, there was a classic movie called Before Sunset that was very good and received renewed attention. What scene was it? It was when the male and female protagonists were drifting down the Seine on a boat and passed Notre Dame. The female protagonist said, "You can't help but think that maybe one day Notre Dame will disappear." How sad that it was so close to her words. But no matter what, thank goodness for this novel. Many things in great works can last forever, just as it does here.